Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Usher, and this is the World of Higher Education podcast. Over the past few decades, higher education has taken on a number of new roles. As we discussed with Ethan Schrum on this podcast over 2 years ago, in the years after World War II, universities became obsessed with showing how essential they were to solving society's problems. One of these problems, particularly as universities proliferated and started showing up in more and more distant locales, was regional economic development. This is a tough problem to solve. Universities are about the knowledge economy, and by and large, the knowledge economy runs most smoothly in places with significant population density. By definition, regional or peripheral institutions are located in places that lack this essential quality. So, with whom can universities in these situations partner? It takes two to tango, the university and a community. And more generally, what kinds of things can universities in peripheral regions do to improve the economic fortunes of the places they serve? Today, my guest is Dr. Romulo Pinheiro. He's a professor of public policy and administration at the University of Agder in Norway. For years now, Romulo has been writing about how universities in different parts of Europe tackle this question. In our interview today, we go back and forth a bit about how peripheral institutions differ from metropolitan ones, how regional and global ambitions get intertwined at these institutions, and how institutional and disciplinary structures do and do not affect how a peripheral university accomplishes its mission. As a wannabe geographer, I found this discussion fascinating. Pay attention to the bits where Romulo starts diving into the intricacies of how institutions and academics weave together their global and local networks into complicated webs. And let me underline this bit, how these webs depend crucially on something pretty simple: trust. But enough from me. Let's turn it over to Romulo. Romulo, your work often usually centers around issues of universities and regional development. And I guess it's been 40 or 50 years now that regional development has been seen as a role that higher education is supposed to play. But how does that development role differ between universities in dense urban areas and less dense rural areas? What's the difference in the role they have to play?
So, Alex, for universities to be able to engage with different types of regional actors, there have to be competences on the other side. So, universities differ in terms of their competences and skills, right? In terms of the depth and breadth of the types of programs they use, the research groups, as well as the traditions of regional engagement. But they also differ in their localities, right? So, uh, usually you have a situation where universities in peripheral regions are thinner institutions and they are located in thinner institutional environments, meaning they don't have a lot of interlocutors with the same level of knowledge and skills, right? So that's already creates a disadvantage, right? So we see this symbiosis between universities and regional and their regional settings. By and large, we see that strong institutions tend to be located in strong regional surroundings as well. Now, that's not to say there are cases of strong institutions in more peripheral settings. And what the literature tells us that for the most part, these regions don't have the absorptive capacity to absorb both the graduates and the knowledge that comes from these thick institutions. So Johns Hopkins is a case in point in Baltimore. And in Europe, we have, for example, University of Twente. There's been a few studies as well. So the knowledge generated by these institutions tends to go away from the region because there's no regional capacity to absorb, what comes out of the university. So that's very different roles.
Okay, well, it seems to me there's two types of rural or peripheral institutions. Let me talk about one of them first, right? So smaller peripheral institutions, I'm thinking, universities maybe in northern Norway, right? A couple thousand students. They face tight budgets. They have limited research capacity, more difficulty, I imagine, in attracting top talent. Maybe not in Norway, but in some countries that would be an issue. And yet they're often expected to play an outsized role in regional development. How do they manage that tension?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and indeed, many don't, right? So you're absolutely right that we should move away from that idea of centers and periphery because there's also centers within the periphery. So there's also strong institutions in peripheral settings, right? In Northern Norway, for example, we have University of Tromsø, which is a comprehensive, research-intensive institution, and there are many smaller regional colleges, for example, scattered across the Nordic region that don't have that capacity. traditionally, the institutions have catered more for the applied needs of regional actors. They didn't have the research infrastructures, so they will get involved in, what we call projectization, right? Smaller projects, and that of course has limitations. Other bolder institutions, they try to collaborate, right? So develop networks. What we see, for example, in Northern Europe is a situation where due to mergers, these institutions, the smaller ones, are becoming amalgamated and part of larger institutions, right? And that, of course, creates new possibilities and new conditions, but also new tensions and dilemmas, because as institutions grow, and as you know, the larger the institution, the more globally oriented scientists in minded you have, the less likely they are to be involved with regional issues, all things being equal, as economists like to say. But in the end, it also goes back to the idea of engagement and academic, the bottom up, right? So it's this combination between what I've been arguing, you can have all these great strategic plans and funding in place, but if academics themselves, if what Burton Clark calls the academic heartland, do not feel keen to be engaged with regional actors, you can't pressure them.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that global dimension in a second, but let me counter with something here. I'm not convinced that the larger institutions are necessarily more global, but they are probably necessarily more oriented towards basic research, right? Like as you get bigger and bigger departments, they get into bigger. And what's the uptake of basic research in peripheral areas? I mean, it just seems to me that there are, when you get past a certain institutional size or institutional complexity, it gets very hard to actually even talk with local communities because the capacity for generating research is much bigger than the receptor capacity for it. I remember, one example I have when we were doing some work in Africa. There was one small private university outside Lagos that they'd sequenced the Ebola virus, and I said, well, can you work with local industry? He said, well, they said we can't work with the local pharmaceutical industry because in Africa the pharmaceutical industry is packaging and marketing, right? Those are the only two things. So what happens when the science at a small regional institution outruns the receptor capacity of the local institution? Are there any good ways to manage that?
Yeah, so it goes back to the example I gave earlier. For the most part, that knowledge tends to go away, right, to other regions or to other localities. This is a global dimension of universities. But this goes back to the point that you bring about the brokeraging role of universities, right? So the university actors have to engage in the process of translating those basic research findings in something that can be applied to the local level. So how do they do that? There are different mechanisms, right? So one is to have professors, going back to this, they are more engaged and they are able to facilitate, say, a more theoretical or analytical discussion into more concrete. The role of students is fundamental here, an aspect that has been somewhat neglected in the literature, right? In the end, the most important, what we call boundary spanners, are actually students who spend time back and forth, as well as the role of graduates, former students, right? They have those networks with the professors and so on. So they play a very important role. But in the end, if those companies across the public and private sector don't have the need for that knowledge, or if that knowledge is not relevant, then they will not use it, right? So there's a tendency. So it's also up to the universities to try to make the basic knowledge, if they are, of course, inclined, relevant to local actors. In Northern Norway, we have a case of the University of Tromsø, which has been able to do that, right? Bring that excellence and relevance together, where they look at, for example, the Sami dimension or the Arctic fauna and flora or heart cardiovascular diseases. So taking aspects that are of relevance to the region and developing excellence around those areas. And in the process, they develop also institutional capacity, which helps them strategically profiling in a globally competitive world.
Okay, so you're raising again that issue of global excellence versus regional relevance. I'm sort of interested from a perspective of university strategy. What avenues do you have to make sure that your institution is actually balancing those two properly? Like what you used Tromsø as an example. Can you think of some others, and are there some commonalities between them?
Yeah, so I mean, university leaders have some tools at their disposal. As we know, most universities, particularly large universities, are very bottom-heavy institutions, right? So they have a lot of autonomy, and the academics are, relatively independent in pursuing. That being said, they also follow incentives as rational actors, right? So there is something that, strategic leaders or university leaders can do to align those incentives, whether it is PhD students, whether it is, sabbaticals, other types of incentives to collaborate with regional actors. Beyond Tromsø, there are other examples that I've worked also in where Oulu is another case in point, for example, in Finland. There's a very interesting antidote, for example, going back to the networks, where a study asked actors in Oulu in northern Finland, who are your most important collaborators? People at university mission, individuals from industry and local government. And then they went to another region north in Sweden, Umeå, which wasn't as regionally engaged. And they asked, who are your most important collaborators? And regional actors in the private sector mention other actors in the private sector. And university academics mention other academics. Those are examples of disconnected, networks. They are networking within their own silos, right? So there has to be sort of a synergic effect here. And the most successful regional institutions are able to do that, right? One interesting caveat, and when you ask them about, do they see themselves as regional universities? Most of them don't like that label. They say that we are first and foremost a university in the region rather than regional university. So there's some negative connotations with these too much closest to locality.
Interesting. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that there are some, we have to pay attention to incentives for professors within the university to engage locally and form those local partnerships. Are there some specific institutional reforms that can achieve that? And how does, presumably a disciplinary mix, right? There's different incentives and different possibilities for collaboration in different disciplines. So how do you manage that engagement? How do you incentivize it effectively?
Yeah. So there's been a long discussion within the Shield about what types of incentives. And I think, again, there is not a one size fits all, right? This has to be done. Academics are incentivized very differently, but we know that for the most part, right, money has a limited effect when compared to other professionals, right? So it's more issues related to, whether you can have more autonomy or develop your research group or being able to set up a center. What we see now, for example, in the Nordic countries is an orchestrated plan by the national funding and the regional funding agencies to ensure that, for example, any research application requires a buy-in from regional actors. So I cannot send an application to Norwegian Research Council, the Academy of Finland, without having partners from, the region or the nation, right, within the public and private sector. So those are structural mechanisms to ensure that if academics, want to have access to important funding for their research and to develop their research teams, they need to bring on board those key actors. The second aspect is this very strong emphasis in the last, say, 7 to 10 years, especially after COVID, on co-creation, co-production of knowledge, right? Rather than traditional role where you would involve regional actors towards the end of a research, journey, endeavor. Now there is an attempt to involve these actors at the design stage, right? So the researchers will go into a project already with some input and with questions, understanding some of important antecedents that are generated, and then involving through a variety of mechanisms, regional actors, in terms of workshops, sandbag exercises, and so on, to make sure there's feedback mechanism and those actors are involved. So it's a much more of an egalitarian, sort of ecosystem. But the extent to which this is working, it's still an empirical question. We don't know the results, but at least those are the intentions.
Romulo, you talked about this interface between the global and the local, right? And the global part of that is usually about relations between academics in one part of the world and academics in another. And so that helps a local university, a university in a region, act as kind of a window on the world for that region, right? It brings them into contact with these global networks. What's the right way to think about developing those networks effectively? I mean, I know in Europe right now, we've got the European Universities Initiative, and I think a number of those are, because they're meant to unite institutions with similar missions. A number of them look like alliances of universities in regions. Is this promising? Is this the right way to go forward? Or are these initiatives missing something?
Yeah, so let me touch first on the issue of networks. So most of these networks are emerge organically, right? And they are very much linked to the relationships that academics have with other academics or academics have with other regional actors, right? Students can also play a role here as, if they gain employment. And of course, you have your former students as part of regional government or industry. And of course, the key element, of course, is trust, right? This is not new. Trust takes time to generate. So I think it's not easy if you are sitting in the rector of a university to be able to articulate a strategy. How are we going to develop trust amongst these actors, right? You have to create conditions. So amongst other things, maybe liberate some, well, you need to identify who are your most engaged academics, you're more likely to engage students and so on, and then create a kind of an ecosystem of bringing these people together. We used to say that the most important thing in regional engagement are to have money to have lunches and dinners, right? That's where people get to know each other. When it comes to the second part of your question, strategic alliances, I'm a bit skeptical to what extent these will benefit the regional engagement agenda, to be honest, because even those alliances like my own institution has, right, with the name For Them, which is very much for them, the regional actors, there is a tendency alliances become very inner oriented, right? And I tend to have a number of publications coming out now with another colleague where we see alliances are primarily collaborative exercises in order to be able to compete globally, right? So, and there's a tendency, despite some efforts going on in terms of policy labs for students involving regional actors around regional questions and so on. But I think there's a natural tendency, like with the academic drift of regional institutions, that they become other strategic imperatives outside the regional and the locality and end up dictating their strategic priorities. That's my sense. But again, it's an important empirical question which we'll have to see in the future what the results are.
So there's been a tendency that, in North America, this probably comes from World War II or maybe even a little bit beforehand, of thinking about universities as fixers of social problems or fixers of economic problems. And, you've cautioned against assuming that universities can act as fixers of regional challenges, especially in peripheral context. In Europe, I guess this is a more recent assumption about institutions, maybe 30 or 40 years old instead of 60 or 70. Where do you think that expectation comes from? And what are the risks of leaning too heavily on?
Yeah, so I mean, this caution comes also from my field work, right? I remember when I was doing my PhD many years ago, I was in South Africa at Nelson Mandela Metro, and speaking with the vice chancellor there, and he told me, "Look, we are keen to play an active regional role, but we're not going to clean the streets because the local government is failing to clean the streets. We don't have capacity to tackle crime because the police doesn't have the resource to tackle crime." So he was very keen to say, part of our work is to go into the communities and educate them about both the possibilities, but also the limitations that universities and academics have. And that is not our role to solve, the failure of market forces or government forces, right? And there's a tendency by some of these local officials to scapegoat the university a little bit and say, you are not delivering, right? Because you are not helping tackling poverty and so on. And that's not to say universities don't have an important role, right? But most of us in the field believe universities have primarily a facilitated role, right? A generative role rather than acting as an engine for regional development. But of course, in those peripheral regions where the university is the larger employer, is the only knowledge institution, of course, expectations are that the university has to play a disproportional role, right? And often it tries to do so, and in many cases it succeeds. But in the majority of cases, universities is one of many different knowledge actors in this very complex ecosystem, right?
So I think you've got, your work has obvious ramifications for higher education leaders, but also for politicians, right? The ones who are funding these institutions. If there's one concept or one conceptual insight from your work that you think those groups should take seriously, higher education leaders and politicians, what would it be? It might not be the same for both, right? They could be different. They could be different for the different audiences.
Yeah. So again, as a traditional academic, let me give you two instead of one. So the first one, and I think I'm not the only one to say these, but I think my work reinforced that idea. both universities and regions are complex entities. They are non-monolithical entities, right? And they tend to be approached both by politicians and by university managers as simple strategic actors, right? They have their histories, they have their, their institutionalized traditions, which are very difficult, to change. And as a result, they should be, any approach of using strategic agency to move universities or regions in particular directions should take that into account. The second aspect is linked to my recent work on resilience, right? Over time, we have seen that universities have had this innate capacity to adapt to social change, right? And play very different roles. We see that the third mission, right? And, in the early 19th century is very different than the third mission today, right? And the university has had that ability so far to be able to, withstand and adjust to some adversity while retaining some degree of function and identity, right? Now, in order to do that, we need two important ingredients. One is autonomy, which is being questioned at the moment, both procedural and substantive autonomy. The second one is diversity. We know from resilient studies that resilient institutions are diverse institutions, right? So when politicians and managers come with this idea of lean approach, right? We have two research groups in innovation doing more or less the same thing. Let's kill or let's merge them. You are basically reducing diversity, right? And reducing diversity means that you're reducing the ability of the institution to withstand possible adversities, whether it's COVID or geopolitical conflict and so on, and that is dangerous, right? It's very tempting in the short run, but it reduces the ability of these universities to adopt in the long run. And that's why most universities have been successful in adjusting to societal events over time. They've had these two ingredients, which are now in risk.
Okay, so given that, what's the future of university community engagement in peripheral regions? Like, is there a trend that we can expect here over the next, say, 10 years? Are institutions going to be able to deliver more fully on the needs of their regions, or are they going to find it more difficult?
Yeah. So as you know, Alex, we are very bad as academics to predicting the future, right? But we often go back to history and see how things have occurred over time. And what we see this transition of the third, what we call the third mission, where it's regional development or social impact or engagement. And what we see is a trend that this third mission is increasingly getting closer to the core activities, right? Today, we can't even talk, social impact is at the core for any university mission. I guess this is, is not new in the US, but at least in Europe, it's something that has occurred in the next 10 or 15 decades. What I think is important, and it seems to be that the work is being done, and some colleagues in the UK, David Charles and others, have alerted is, let's see what the challenges facing our societies, right? Increasing bipolarization, the rise of illiberal democracies, the post-truth society. So we should ask is, what role do universities, particularly in peripheral regions, can have, right, in order to be able to help their societies, right, navigate this very turbulent environment. And by being the quintessential knowledge institutions, of course, universities play a very important role and should maybe be more active and aggressive in defending the importance of knowledge, the importance of truth. I'm currently involved in some projects on regional green transitions. And the consensus seems to be universities play a very important role in mediating relationships amongst regional actors with very different agendas, right? They still have the legitimacy. They have been able to, not being politicized enough, to bringing different political actors into one roof and orchestrate an agenda. But of course, that's time consuming. That doesn't necessarily always bring positive benefits in the short term. So there has to be a willingness by university leaders also to take risks, a willingness to allow academics to play roles that perhaps, do not necessarily, that move beyond these traditional roles of teaching and research. So that's how I see things. So a rediscovering of the civic role of universities in an important historical moment where, so moving a discussion from interests and money to values and norms.
Romulo Pinheiro, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Alex.
And it just remains for me to thank our excellent producers, Tiffany McLennan and Sam Pufek, and you, our viewers, listeners, and readers, for following us. If you have any questions or concerns about today's episode or suggestions for future ones, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at podcast@higheredstrategy.com. Run, don't walk to our YouTube page and hit subscribe. That way you'll never miss an episode of The World of Higher Education. Join us next week when our guest will be consultant Roger Smythe from New Zealand, He'll be chatting with us about the absolutely phenomenal number of new developments in higher education in that country in the period leading up to this fall's general election. Bye for now.